Have you ever seen a child pretend they don't care, when deep down their heart is breaking? In a room full of laughter, sometimes the loudest sound is silence, and on this Father's Day, one little girl's silence spoke louder than all the cheers combined. At Greenwood Elementary School in Brooklyn, the air buzzed with excitement. Streamers hung across the chalkboard, and Father's Day cards, messy with glitter, glue, and crayon drawings, were taped proudly to the walls. The teacher had done her best to make the classroom glow with celebration. It was a day meant for joy, for the children to beam with pride as their fathers sat beside them, listening to stories, receiving cards, and sharing snacks. But not every child had a reason to smile. At the back corner of the room sat Alara, a small girl with hair tied back in a loose braid, her eyes fixed on the desk. She clutched a folded piece of paper, a handmade card colored in blue and yellow crayons. She had drawn a man with kind eyes and broad shoulders, the father she wished she could have by her side. But the chair next to her remained empty. The teacher tried to keep the mood light, clapping her hands, encouraging the students to present their cards. One by one, the children skipped to the front, holding their father's hands, their faces shining as they showed off their creations. "This one's for you, Dad," one boy shouted, making the class giggle. A little girl wrapped her arms around her father's neck, squealing as he lifted her into the air. Everywhere Alara looked, there was warmth, except at her desk. She kept her head down, tracing the edge of her paper with her small fingers. She wished, for just a moment, she could vanish into the floor. But the children noticed. They always did. A murmur spread through the rows of desks, hushed whispers quickly turning into snickers. "Where's her dad?" one boy whispered loudly enough to be heard. "Maybe she doesn't have one," another girl giggled, covering her mouth with her hand. The words cut deeper than they realized. Each laugh felt like a weight pressing on Alara's chest. She pressed the card flat against the desk, afraid her trembling hands would give away the storm inside her. She remembered the night before, sitting at the kitchen table in their small apartment. Her mother had encouraged her to draw something anyway. "Your heart is beautiful, Alara. Put that on paper. Someday, it'll be enough." She had smiled through her mother's words, but the truth was, she hated Father's Day. Every year it reminded her of the empty chair. Now, in that bright classroom, her worst fear played out. Her classmates' laughter grew louder, bolder, feeding off her silence. One boy leaned back in his chair and whispered cruelly, "She probably made the card for herself." The others chuckled, and the sound spread like wildfire. Alara's cheeks burned. She wanted to disappear, to fold herself into the paper she held and hide inside the crayon colors. But she sat frozen, her body stiff, her eyes locked on the wooden floorboards. And still, the chair beside her stayed empty. The teacher glanced at her, perhaps noticing the tension, but hesitated. It was Father's Day, breaking the illusion of happiness in the room seemed too heavy. So the teacher moved on, clapping for another child, cheering loudly as the room filled with applause. For everyone else, it was a moment of joy. For Alara, it was a reminder of the space no one could fill. In that single corner of the classroom, time seemed to slow. The laughter around her blurred into a dull ringing in her ears. She thought of what it would feel like to have someone walk through the door just for her, to sit beside her, to smile, to hold her hand and tell her she wasn't alone. But dreams like that felt too fragile, too far away. Instead, she lowered her head even further, pressing her forehead against the folded card. It was the only shield she had against the cruelty of the moment. The whispers returned. "She doesn't even look up. Maybe she's embarrassed. Maybe she doesn't have anyone at all." And still, she said nothing. Because what could she say? The truth wasn't a story her classmates would understand. The truth was a scar, invisible to them but heavy for her to carry. Father's Day wasn't a celebration for Alara. It was a wound reopened year after year, a day when the chair beside her shouted louder than words ever could, "You are alone." She gripped her card tighter, and silently prayed for the day to end. Have you ever noticed how cruelty seems to echo louder in crowded places? The cafeteria was alive with noise that day, plates clattering, laughter bouncing off tiled walls, and the irresistible aroma of pizza and fries hanging in the air. For most of the children at Greenwood Elementary, it was just another lunch break. But for Elara, it was something else. Her hands clutched a plastic tray that seemed heavier than it should be. On it sat a single sandwich, neatly wrapped, and a small carton of milk. Compared to the overflowing plates of her classmates, it looked meager, lonely, almost, just like her. She walked carefully between the rows of tables, her eyes low, her steps small, as if hoping that if she moved softly enough, no one would notice her. But they did. They always did. At a table near the center, the morning's whispers had turned into cruel theater. A group of kids had decided to make Elara's pain into their entertainment. One boy pulled out a chair dramatically and sat beside it, mimicking the way other fathers had done earlier. Another child pretended to hold an invisible hand, exaggerating the scene with laughter. "Look," one of them said mockingly, "Elara's dad finally showed up." The others howled with laughter, clapping at the cruel performance. Elara heard every word. Every laugh. Every cruel echo. She tried to walk past them, but their voices seemed to reach for her, wrapping around her shoulders, dragging her deeper into the shame she carried. She gripped the tray tighter, her knuckles turning white, and finally stopped at the far corner of the cafeteria. There, away from the noise, she lowered her tray onto the table and slid into the seat. She stared at the sandwich, her appetite gone. The bread looked dry, and the carton of milk seemed to mock her hunger. But the truth was, food wasn't the problem. The problem was the hollow space inside her chest, the ache that grew louder every time someone reminded her of the father she didn't have. Around her, the cafeteria roared with chatter, but in her corner, it was silent. She sat alone, pulling her sandwich closer but not daring to unwrap it. She wasn't hungry. She was hurting. At the center table, the cruel reenactment hadn't stopped. The children were louder now, some standing up, repeating that empty chair scene with exaggerated sobs, pretending to clutch fake cards and cry into them. Laughter exploded from their table, spilling across the cafeteria. A few kids from other tables glanced over, then joined in, pointing, chuckling. Elara lowered her head even further. The sound wasn't just noise, it was a blade cutting into her heart. And then, everything changed. The cafeteria doors swung open with a force that made the metal handles slam against the wall. The noise cut almost instantly, fading into confused silence. The clatter of forks and trays stilled as dozens of heads turned toward the entrance. Standing there was a man unlike anyone the students had ever seen in their school cafeteria. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that seemed out of place among ketchup stains and plastic trays. His shoes gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the sharp cut of his jawline made him look as though he had walked straight out of a magazine cover. But what truly silenced the room was his presence, calm, commanding, and unshakable. Whispers began almost immediately. "Is that? No way, it can't be him. I saw his picture in the news last week." The name began circling the room like wildfire, Victor Hale. The reclusive CEO of Hale Enterprises. The man who built one of New York's most powerful companies. A name spoken with reverence in boardrooms, and now, here he was, standing in the middle of Greenwood Elementary's cafeteria. Children gawked, some recognizing his face from articles their parents had read at the breakfast table. Others stared in confusion, sensing his importance even if they didn't know who he was. Teachers froze, unsure of how to respond. The air was charged, buzzing with curiosity. But Victor Hale didn't seem interested in anyone else. His eyes scanned the room, slowly sweeping across the tables filled with wide-eyed children. And then, he saw her. Elara. Her small frame, huddled in the corner, clutching her sandwich as though it was her only defense. Her head tilted down, but he caught the glimmer of her eyes when she risked a glance upward. For a fraction of a second, the world seemed to stop for him. Victor's gaze locked onto hers, and in that instant, the bustling cafeteria might as well have been empty. The cruel laughter at the center table faltered. One by one, the children turned to see where the powerful man's eyes had landed. Their mocking grins faded, confusion replacing them. Why was the CEO, the Victor Hale, looking at Elara, the girl they had just humiliated? Elara felt the weight of his stare, her chest tightening. She didn't understand. Why was he here? Why was he looking at her, as if she mattered in a room where she had always been invisible? The silence deepened, heavy and expectant. It was as though everyone knew something was about to happen, something no one in that cafeteria would ever forget. Victor Hale took a step forward. And in that single movement, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Have you ever witnessed a moment so unexpected that it stole the air right out of the room? That was what happened in Greenwood Elementary's cafeteria. The whispers had died into silence, the cruel laughter gone as if it had never existed. All eyes watched as Victor Hale, the man in the navy suit, the name whispered in headlines and business columns, walked with quiet purpose across the room. He didn't look at the teachers, who were stiff with unease, unsure of how to approach someone of his stature. He didn't acknowledge the popular kids at the front tables, the ones now grinning and waving, eager to catch his attention. They thought surely, he must be here for them. Surely someone like Victor Hale would gravitate toward the brightest, loudest, most noticed in the room. But Victor Hale's eyes never wavered. They stayed fixed on one small figure in the corner, Elara. Her heart hammered in her chest as he drew closer. Every step seemed to echo against the tiles, a sound louder than the cafeteria had ever known. She tightened her fingers around the edge of her tray, her sandwich trembling in her grasp. Her mind swirled with questions. Why was he coming here? Why her? And then, the unthinkable happened. Victor reached her table. The corner that had always been hers, the corner that spoke of loneliness and invisibility. Without a word, he pulled out the empty chair beside her. The very chair others had mocked that morning, the one that had stood as a symbol of absence. He placed his hand on it, then looked at her with calm eyes, his voice deep but gentle. Mind if I join you? Gasps rippled across the cafeteria. It was as though the air had been knocked out of every student in the room. Victor Hale, one of the most powerful men in New York, wasn't sitting with the popular group. He wasn't at the teacher's table. He was asking to sit beside Elara, the girl they had ridiculed. Elara's lips parted, but no sound came out. She wasn't used to anyone asking if they could sit with her. Usually, people asked her to move. She lowered her eyes, unsure if she could trust what was happening. Yet something about the steadiness in his tone made her nod, just slightly. Victor smiled faintly, the kind of smile that wasn't rehearsed for cameras or business deals. It was softer, almost private. He lowered himself into the chair beside her, and the sound of his suit brushing against the metal seat rang louder than all the whispers in the room. The children stared, wide-eyed. The same chair they had mocked now held a man whose name carried weight in skyscrapers and newsrooms. Victor leaned slightly toward her tray, eyeing the sandwich she hadn't touched. Looks good, he said simply, reaching for it as if he were at a banquet table rather than a school cafeteria. He broke the sandwich in half with his hands and took a bite. Silence. Utter silence. The students who had laughed earlier shifted uncomfortably. Their cruel reenactment now seemed small, pitiful in the shadow of this gesture. Elara blinked, stunned. She had expected him to speak in the grand way adults did when they wanted to impress kids. But instead, he acted like it was the most natural thing in the world, to sit here, to share her food, to treat her corner of the cafeteria as if it was the only table that mattered. She watched as he chewed thoughtfully, then reached for the bottle of water he had brought with him. He took a sip, set it down, and glanced back at her. His eyes weren't piercing the way businessmen's usually were when they calculated their next move. They were steady, calm, almost reassuring. For a long moment, she just stared at him. Confusion painted her face. Why would someone like him sit here, with her? But slowly, like sunlight breaking through heavy clouds, a flicker of something else bloomed in her chest. Comfort. Warmth. Victor's presence wasn't loud or commanding anymore. It was steady, a silent shield that wrapped around her corner of the cafeteria, transforming it into a place of dignity. The other children shifted uneasily in their seats. The same kids who had laughed the loudest now couldn't bring themselves to meet his eyes. Their mocking had lost its power. Their cruelty had been drowned out by a single, simple act, sitting beside her. And Elara, though still trembling inside, felt something shift as well. For the first time that day, she wasn't invisible. She wasn't the target of whispers. She was the girl beside Victor Hale. Her heart, which had been heavy with humiliation just hours before, felt lighter now, as though someone had lifted part of the burden she carried. She didn't understand why he was here, or what it meant, but for this moment, she wasn't alone. And that, for Elara, was everything. The cafeteria was still buzzing, though not with the usual carefree noise of children laughing over sandwiches and juice boxes. Today, whispers carried sharper edges. Groups of students huddled together, throwing glances toward the small, round table near the corner. That table, where Elara sat with her untouched lunch, was no longer just another spot in the room. It had become a stage, and every eye seemed fixed on it. Elara's small hands fidgeted with the strap of her backpack. Her eyes darted between the floor tiles and the curious stares. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into the folds of the world where nobody pointed, nobody whispered, and nobody cared that she didn't have what the others had, a father to celebrate. But then, there was him. Victor Harrington. The man with the kind eyes that contrasted so sharply with his sharp, tailored suit. The man no one expected to be there, sitting beside her at that cafeteria table like it was the most natural thing in the world. The room shifted. The once echoing laughter dimmed, not because it was gone, but because it suddenly didn't matter anymore. Victor leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the table. He wasn't towering over her, wasn't looking down on her. Instead, he bent just enough to make his eyes level with hers. "What's your favorite subject in school?" His voice was low, gentle, carrying none of the commanding authority that his boardroom employees knew so well. Elara's throat tightened. Her instinct was to shrug, to say nothing, to escape into silence. For so long, her words had either gone unheard or been used against her. But Victor didn't look away. His eyes held hers, steady and calm, like he had all the time in the world just for her. She swallowed. I like drawing," she whispered, her voice trembling as if afraid it might break. Victor's face softened, a smile flickering at the edges of his lips. "Drawing?" he asked, leaning in a little more, like she had just revealed a secret worth protecting. "What do you draw?" Elara blinked. The cafeteria noise began to blur, softening to a distant hum. The sting of earlier laughter dulled as something unexpected warmed her chest. Someone actually cared to know. I draw my dreams," she said, her words spilling slowly, cautiously. "When I don't know how to say things. When it feels too hard. I put them on paper." Her fingers traced invisible lines on the tabletop as if sketching an unseen picture. "Sometimes, it's places I wish I could go. Or people I wish I could meet. Or, just feelings. Like, when you want to scream but you can't." Victor didn't interrupt. He didn't nod impatiently like adults sometimes did when they were only half listening. He listened fully, as though each syllable carried weight. To him, her words weren't just a child's musings. They were treasures. The cafeteria around them was no longer mocking. The students who had jeered earlier sat frozen, their half-eaten snacks forgotten. They watched, some with guilt prickling in their chests, others with a curiosity they didn't dare admit. Elara noticed it too, the silence, the stares. For once, though, it didn't make her shrink. It didn't make her want to disappear. Because right here, right now, she wasn't invisible. Victor tilted his head slightly. You know, he said, his tone thoughtful, some of the greatest things in this world started as drawings. Buildings. Inventions. Even dreams that changed lives. Her eyes widened, the fear in them giving way to a spark of something new. Really? Really, he said firmly. The world you imagine, the one you put on paper, is a world no one else can see until you show them. That's a gift, Elara. Never let anyone tell you it isn't. Her chest swelled, a tightness loosening. For the first time that day, maybe even longer, she felt lighter. Around them, the cafeteria might as well have been a different planet. Students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing how cruel their earlier words had sounded compared to the kindness spilling across this small table. Teachers at the back glanced at one another, unsure how to interrupt what had become something far greater than a lunchtime gathering. Elara dared a small smile. I want to draw stories, she said, her voice steadier now. Not just pictures. Stories about people who feel alone. So they know they're not. Victor's heart tightened. Of all the boardrooms he'd commanded, of all the meetings and presentations he'd sat through, none had ever felt as powerful as this moment, a child sharing her fragile dreams, believing for the first time that they mattered. He nodded slowly. That's a beautiful dream, Elara. And I think the world needs it. The words landed like a seed in her heart. Hope. Validation. A recognition she had never received before. The bell rang, a sharp sound that jolted the room back into motion. Students scrambled to pack up, the spell of silence breaking into murmurs and hurried footsteps. But the whispers weren't the same anymore. They carried less mockery, more hesitation. Respect, even. Elara gathered her things, her hands steadier than they had been when she walked into the cafeteria. Giving her a small nod, a silent promise that their conversation mattered, that she mattered. For the first time in a long while, Elara didn't feel like an outsider in her own story. She felt seen. Truly, deeply seen. And that changed everything. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows that stretched across the school playground. The air held the warmth of the day, yet the breeze carried a chill that hinted at the coming night. The swings creaked softly, moving back and forth though no one pushed them. Victor Harrington stood at the edge of the schoolyard, his hands in his pockets. He wasn't here for photographs or flashing cameras. There was no board of directors expecting a speech, no reporters scribbling in notepads. He had slipped into this place almost unnoticed, his expensive shoes crunching softly against the gravel. He could have been anywhere that evening. At a business dinner, in a meeting with investors, or sitting in his penthouse office reviewing contracts. Yet something had pulled him here, to the same ground where children played, where laughter usually spilled into the open sky. And there she was. Elara. She sat on a swing, her small body curved slightly forward, hands gripping the cold chains. The toes of her shoes dragged across the dirt as she rocked slowly, aimlessly, like a clock counting down to something only she understood. Victor watched her for a moment, and in that quiet span of time, he saw more than a lonely girl on a swing. He saw a child holding the weight of years she should never have carried. He saw resilience, yes, but also a deep ache that reminded him of shadows from his own past. He approached slowly, his footsteps deliberate, not wanting to startle her. When the gravel crunched beneath his feet, Elara looked up. Her eyes flickered with recognition, surprise, then something else. Relief, maybe. You came back, she said softly. Victor gave a small nod. I did. He gestured to the empty swing beside her. May I? Elara hesitated for a moment, then gave the faintest of nods. Victor lowered himself onto the swing, the chains groaning under his weight. For a while, they sat in silence, both swaying gently. The world around them grew quieter, the fading chatter of children going home, the distant call of a bird, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Finally, Elara broke the silence. "You must be busy," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Important people don't usually come back." Victor exhaled, his breath heavy. "Sometimes, the most important things aren't the ones people think." Her brow furrowed slightly, as if puzzling over his words. Then she looked down at her shoes scraping against the dirt. "I don't know my father," she said suddenly. Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of something rehearsed in her heart many times before. Victor turned toward her, but he didn't interrupt. "I've never met him," she continued, her voice low. "My mom, she used to tell me stories. Little things, like how he smiled, or how he wanted to name me after his grandmother. But then, she got sick." Her small hands tightened on the chains of the swing. The metal clinked softly. "And one day, she was just gone. And all I had left were those stories. Fragments. Like pages torn out of a book." Her voice caught for a moment, but she pushed through. "So, every Father's Day, when the other kids make cards and gifts, I don't have anyone to give mine to. I sit there, pretending it doesn't hurt, but it does. It always does." Victor felt his chest tighten, an ache rising in him he hadn't expected. For a moment, he wasn't the man on the swing beside her. He wasn't the CEO with millions in his bank account. He was a boy again, a boy who had once stood outside a bakery with empty pockets, breathing in the smell of bread he couldn't afford. A boy who had learned too early what absence felt like, what hunger did to a soul. He swallowed hard, staring at the ground as though it might steady him. Her pain was not just hers anymore. It was his too. "Elara," he said quietly, his voice rough with something unspoken. "I know what it feels like to be left behind. To wonder why you weren't enough for someone to stay. To carry questions no one ever answers." Her eyes flickered toward him, searching his face, perhaps for proof that he wasn't just saying it to comfort her. And what she saw there, the shadows in his expression, the heaviness in his gaze, told her he meant every word. Victor gripped the swing's chain tighter. He could have offered her the polished phrases he used in boardrooms, the kind of lines that impressed crowds and won applause. But here, none of that mattered. Only honesty did. "I grew up without a father too," he admitted. "And for a long time, I thought it made me less. Like I was missing some piece that everyone else had. I tried to hide it, tried to act like it didn't matter. But it did. It always did." Elara's lips parted, surprise softening into something gentler, understanding. The two of them sat there, dusk wrapping around them like a fragile cocoon. The playground, usually filled with shouts and laughter, was theirs alone now. Two lives separated by decades and status, yet connected by a wound that looked remarkably the same. Victor's heart thudded, each beat heavy with realization. This wasn't about pity. This wasn't about charity. Sitting beside Elara, listening to her voice, small yet fierce, wounded yet unbroken, he felt something shift deep within him. It wasn't chance that had led him into that cafeteria days ago. It wasn't luck that had placed him on this swing now. It felt like destiny. And as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, casting the playground in a soft, fading glow, Victor knew with certainty. This child wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was a mirror of the boy he once was. And perhaps, just perhaps, the reason he had fought so hard to escape his past was so he could one day sit here, and make sure she never had to face hers alone. The library was almost deserted, save for the faint hum of the ceiling lights and the soft tick of the clock mounted high on the wall. Rows of books stood like silent witnesses, their spines carrying decades of words, stories, and secrets. The air smelled faintly of dust and paper, the scent of time preserved. Victor sat at one of the long oak tables, his presence oddly out of place in the dim-lit school library. The man who once commanded skyscraper boardrooms now sat in a chair meant for parents at reading night. His tie was loosened, his jacket draped over the back of the chair. He wasn't here as a CEO. He was here as something else, though he hadn't yet found the word for it. Across from him, Elara fidgeted, her small hands worrying over something she held. A folded letter, its edges worn soft, the paper yellowed by years of waiting. Victor's gaze dropped to it. "What's that?" he asked gently. Elara hesitated. Her lips parted, closed again, and finally she whispered, "It was my mom's." She pushed it toward him with trembling fingers, the paper almost slipping from her grasp. She said, "It was meant for someone important." Victor reached across the table, his hand brushing hers briefly as he took the letter. The paper was fragile, like holding a fragment of the past that had survived too much. His fingers unfolded it carefully, as though afraid it might crumble in his hands. The handwriting was neat but faint, the ink slightly faded. As his eyes scanned the opening lines, he felt his chest tighten. The words spoke with a familiarity that tugged at something long buried. And then, there it was. His name. Victor Harrington. Written in her mother's hand. He froze. The air in the library seemed to shift, thickening until every breath felt heavier than the last. He read again, as though his mind was playing tricks on him, but there was no mistake. The words were clear. His heart pounded, echoing against his ribs. He could hear nothing else. The clock ticking on the wall faded, the distant voices of children outside the library doors dulled into nothing. He kept reading. The letter spoke of a time long ago, when her mother had crossed paths with a man named Victor. He remembered those years, the raw, hungry climb toward success. The endless nights he had worked, scraping his way up from nothing, blind to everything except the next step. And in those days, when he had been nothing more than a man clawing at survival, there had been a woman. Kind. Gentle. She had offered him help without asking for anything in return, a warm meal when he had none, a word of encouragement when he had nearly given up. She had believed in him when no one else had. And he had walked away. Too focused, too blinded by ambition to see the weight of what he was leaving behind. Victor's breath caught as the final words of the letter trembled before his eyes. Words that spoke of a child. A hope that someday, if the world allowed, Elara would know the truth, that her father was not absent by choice, but by circumstance. That he was a man named Victor Harrington. The name that now burned in his hands. The room spun. The world tilted. And suddenly, everything aligned. Elara. The little girl who sat across from him, clutching her sleeves nervously, watching his face for a reaction. The girl he had felt drawn to, as though some invisible thread had pulled him into her orbit. She wasn't just a child he had stumbled upon in a cafeteria. She wasn't just a reminder of his past. She was his daughter. The realization struck with the force of a wave crashing over him, knocking the breath from his lungs. He gripped the letter tighter, his knuckles white, as the enormity of it sank in. His eyes lifted slowly, meeting Elara's. And in that gaze, everything changed. The lines of her face, the curve of her nose, the shape of her eyes, details he had seen before, but now recognized as echoes of someone he once knew. Someone he had lost. Elara, his voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. She tilted her head, her eyes wide, searching. "Do you know what it says?" Victor swallowed hard, the lump in his throat making words impossible. He wanted to speak, to tell her everything, but his heart was tangled in the storm of memory and regret. "Yes," he finally managed, his voice breaking. "I know." Her small fingers curled on the tabletop, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "It's important, isn't it?" Victor's breath shuddered out of him. He wanted to reach across the table, to take her hand, to bridge the years that had stolen so much. But the weight of his choices, the blindness of his ambition, pressed down on him like stone. He nodded slowly. More important than you know. Silence filled the library again, heavy and fragile. Victor lowered his gaze to the letter once more, tracing the handwriting with his finger, as though by touching the words he could touch the woman who had written them. The woman who had once given him kindness he hadn't deserved. The woman who had left him this legacy without his knowing. His mind replayed it all, the hunger, the drive, the relentless pursuit of success. The doors he had closed behind him, never looking back. And now, the truth stood before him, flesh and blood, carrying the face of the past and the hope of the future. Elara shifted in her chair, her voice barely audible. You knew my mom. Victor looked up again, his eyes glassy, his throat raw. He wanted to say yes, but the word was too small for what he felt. I did, he said at last, his voice trembling. And she changed my life. The clock ticked louder in the silence that followed, each second echoing with the truth that could no longer be undone. In that quiet library, among the dust and forgotten stories, Victor Harrington's world shifted forever. He had come searching for answers, burdened with questions. And in the trembling hands of a child, he had found both his past and his future. Elara wasn't just a girl he had chosen to see. She was the daughter he had unknowingly left behind. And now, faced with the truth written in faded ink, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: he could not walk away again. The world was quiet in those early hours, when night reluctantly surrendered to morning. Coney Island stretched out in hushed stillness, its carnival rides motionless, the usual crowds replaced by the rhythmic hush of the Atlantic rolling against the sand. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of salt and the faint promise of a new day. Victor walked slowly along the weathered pier, his steps steady yet heavy, each one echoing across the wooden boards that stretched into the sea. Beside him, Elara's small feet pattered lightly, her gaze shifting between the horizon and the man at her side. She had never been here before, never seen the ocean wake up beneath a rising sun. The sky was beginning to change, streaks of pink and orange bleeding into the fading indigo of night. The waves mirrored the light, each crest catching gold for a moment before dissolving back into the deep. Neither of them spoke at first. Words felt fragile, too small against the vastness of the sea and the weight of what lingered between them. Victor's hands remained deep in his pockets, his thoughts knotted, the letter still burning in his memory. Elara, quiet but observant, swung her arms gently, waiting with a patience uncommon for a child. When they reached the very edge of the pier, Victor finally stopped. He turned to face the ocean, his shoulders rising and falling with a breath that trembled slightly. Elara tilted her head, watching him, sensing the storm inside him. Beautiful, isn't it? He asked softly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Elara nodded. It feels big. Like it never ends. Victor let out a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. That's exactly how life felt to me for a long time. Endless. Like I had to keep running, keep building, keep proving myself. I thought if I reached far enough, maybe the emptiness inside would finally go away. He paused, the waves filling the silence. Then he lowered himself onto one knee, not out of grandeur, but because the weight of the truth demanded it. His eyes, usually so controlled, glistened now, the edges blurred with tears he had carried for too many years. Elara, his voice cracked, the name breaking on his lips. She blinked, startled by the rawness in his tone. Her small hands clutched the railing, the wood rough beneath her fingers. He drew in a breath, steadying himself, and finally let the words escape, words that had been pressing against his chest since the library, words that felt both terrifying and liberating. You are my daughter. The sound of it seemed to ripple across the pier, carried away by the morning breeze. His voice trembled, but the truth in it was unshakable. Elara froze. For a moment, her wide eyes simply stared at him, as if her heart needed time to catch up with her ears. You, what? She whispered, her voice so small it nearly dissolved into the ocean's roar. Victor's tears slipped free now, unhidden, glistening in the growing sunlight. He reached for her hand, his own trembling as he held it gently, like something precious he feared might vanish if he gripped too tightly. All this time. I didn't know, he said, his words tumbling out, heavy with regret. I didn't know your mother's kindness, her love, her strength, had left me this gift. I was blind, chasing things that never mattered, while the most important part of me was out there in the world, without me. Ilara's throat tightened, her eyes filling with tears that spilled down her cheeks in quiet streams. For so long she had carried the ache of not knowing, the hollow silence of absence. And now, the void had a name. Not an empty name scribbled in an old letter, but a man kneeling before her, his eyes begging for her to believe. "You're my dad?" she asked, her voice quivering. Victor nodded, his chest heaving as though the admission itself had broken something open inside him. "Yes, Ilara. I am. And I can't change the years we lost, but I promise you, I will never walk away again. Not from you." Her small fingers tightened around his hand, clinging to him as though afraid the ocean might carry him away. Her sobs came then. Not sharp with pain, but soft with release, like a dam breaking after holding too much for too long. Victor pulled her into his arms, his embrace strong yet fragile, his tears mingling with hers as he pressed his face into her hair. For the first time in years, he felt whole, not because of the billions in his name, not because of the empire he had built, but because of the little girl who fit perfectly in the hollow space he had never managed to fill. The sun rose higher, spilling light over them, gilding the pier in gold. Around them, the Atlantic kept its steady rhythm, a heartbeat in sync with their own. For Ilara, Father's Day would never again be a day of sitting alone, of watching others celebrate what she thought she would never have. She had a hand to hold now, a name to claim, and a father who had finally found her. For Victor, success was no longer measured in wealth or towers of glass scraping the sky. Success was this moment. Kneeling on a wooden pier with his daughter's hand in his, the sun rising not just on a new day, but on a new life. He whispered into her hair, voice breaking but sure. "I love you, Ilara. More than anything I've ever built, more than anything I've ever achieved. You're my greatest treasure." Her tears turned into a smile, fragile but radiant, her small arms tightening around him. "I love you too, Dad." The words, simple, trembling, yet profound, struck Victor deeper than any accolade he had ever received. The world around them stirred, gulls circling overhead, the first stirrings of life along the boardwalk, but for them, time seemed to pause. The ocean stretched out endlessly, the sun climbing higher, as though the universe itself bore witness to the bond sealed on that pier. Two lives once apart were now bound together, not by chance, not by charity, but by truth and love. And as the waves kissed the shore with each passing beat, Victor knew one thing with certainty. The story of his life was no longer about the empire he had built. It was about the daughter he had found. And this time, he would not let her go.